Page to Stage Tips from Second C's Queued by I'm Pictures LLC. And this time we are going to go through a few famous works and we're going to look at them from the lens of a producer. So basically, we're going to be looking at how these works operate as models of authority and collapse, conflict and control, identity recognition, civil order, and breakdown. We're going from Greek tragedy to epic poetry and strategic philosophy. And we're looking at how civilization organized itself and how it rose and fell. And we are going to be looking at basically how stageable it is. So that's what our main focus is on here. And we're going through some ancient works because we're going kind of in a more organized fashion. Of course, it's going to have some different elements here, but we're definitely going to more organized fashion here today. And we'll be, of course, covering more modern works too. Do not be worried. It's a good idea to support the work, support theater, support the arts as well, but we're kind of looking at things from a more producer point of view. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's look at the core of what we're trying to do. So when we look at a core framework for a stage and creation, we're looking at if a work can really transform and really stand the test of time. Not just, oh, it's a very seminal work in this area or that area from an academic point of view, but can it be staged? Can this work come into the stage form? And how might that happen? So we're really looking at, are these works really adaptable to the stage? Are they not adaptable to the stage? Can a work transcend? So we're really going to be looking only at works that we feel could transcend the stage. Of course, some of them were made for the stage already, so of course they obviously do. But we might see if they can translate to other art forms, and so on and so forth. So right now we are going to get ready, and I'm going to show you an example of how we want to look at things as well. So we'll look at Anabasis by Xenophon, which we have already looked at before. And the core principle, of course, is survival under spatial constraint, which produces authority for the stage. And then we can see some extensions or derived mechanisms or how it happens. So authority here raises through disciplined movement within constrained space, and it's environmental pressure, which enforces group cohesion, leadership emerging from necessity rather than designation. And then, of course, we have edge or boundary conditions when the system might fail. So, for example, it could fail if leadership becomes purely psychological interpretation, detached from material condition, or collapse if space no longer structures action, or if survival is treated maybe only as a metaphor. So this is just a little example of how we're breaking it down. And we're going to break it down as well from a producer point of view in more detail. We will be focusing on some of these areas for you. So let's get to it. The first one we're going to talk about is The Art of War by Lao Tzu. And this is a strategic treatise from around the 5th century BCE or BC, whatever, however you want to say it. This is not merely a narrative about war. It's more of a performance system. We can also consider it as a performance system about coordination, concealment, timing, and control under pressure. And the governing principle is very simple. Authority is earned operationally, not symbolically. Victory occurs before a confrontation becomes visible. The work survives adaptation only if movement remains legible, hierarchy remains spatially readable, and strategic change can be understood without exposition. If explanation becomes necessary, the system will be somewhat weaker. And so let's look at some more details here. The reason why it will work on stage is the audience needs power physically before verbally. The dramaturgy would depend on formation and integrity, directional movement, concealment, delayed revelation, and shifts in spatial balance. The core test is not just emotional. So, in other words, it's a bit of informational instability. Who knows what, who controls what, who's visible, who's absent intentionally. So, as far as structural operations, we can see our authority system is distributed operational authority. Leadership is validated through successful coordination rather than title or speech. Hierarchy must appear functional. And the constraint system is procedural constraint. Every movement should be governed by terrain, timing, visibility, fatigue, and logistic. Nothing occurs without consequence. Temporal system is interruption and delayed revelation. The rhythm alternates between concealment, pause, faint silence, and sudden concentration of force. This work breathes through controlled delay. So for a transmission system, we could say that it's compressed operational instruction, and meaning survives through repetition, aphoristic compression, and mnemonic clarity. So language functions like architecture here, and we'll look at the different parts. So the battlefield remains unstable, no force possesses complete information, which is true. Movement matters more than confrontation. The audience should feel uncertainty before conflict. And false weakness becomes tactical leverage. Retreats, silence, pauses, and redirections recognize the perception itself. Victory begins emerging structurally before combat occurs. As we said, and this is the operational center, the losing side collapses organizationally before it collapses militarily. The final confrontation merely confirms an earlier strategic defeat. The climax is failed coordination, not emotional catharsis. So for visual governance, we could have lighting that functions tactically rather than atmospherically. Darkness means incomplete intelligence, hidden force, delayed action, uncertainty of position. Light reveals operational changes, and you should avoid decorated mood lighting, for example. Visual tension could emerge from concealed force, unstable spatial balance, directional ambiguity, sounds before movement, uncertainty of initiative. The audience must constantly evaluate positional control. And I should always be moved towards formation shifts, command vectors, spatial imbalance, and coordinated movement. If spectacle is overall like the main focus, this will fail. So the arrangement of bodies before combat begins, not the combat itself, is kind of the more important thing. And this would fail if it becomes only exposition, or combat becomes decorative spectacle, or spatial logic becomes unclear, or commanders become over psychologized, or hierarchy loses immediate readability. So basically, the system can survive only through visible clarity. So, this could work as large-scale formation choreography, emphasizing rhythm, concealment, coordinated movement, and command visibility. So this could work as a dance. You could even make it like a little plot or a series of examples as a new narrative form of what he's talking about. This could be a site-specific performance where terrain becomes the dramaturgy itself, with elevation, weather, distance, and so forth, and environmental resistance. And you could also use this as a ritual adaptation. So you would have extreme reduction using banners, precision, shadows, directional movement, and formation geometry. So basically, this is not war as an emotional spectacle. This would be more like focusing on something like strategy, kind of like chess, visual chess. The audience needs to understand the spatial control and the strategic control. So it's a medium risk. The ensemble size would be 16 to 80 performers. Touring viability could be 8 out of 10. It would be really concerning if formation loses readability, technical clarity becomes inconsistent, decorative combat overtakes procedural logic, or command hierarchy weakens under movement stress, or exposition, for example, becomes necessary for comprehension. So don't stage if combat functions primarily as spectacle, or authority cannot be identified, or concealment, revelation, so forth, lose precision, or audiences require narration too much to follow strategic shift, or spatial logic is too arbitrary, scene to scene. So essentially, we could give it a 89% because you could do it, but it would have to have really disciplined directorial oversight, and it would need to have an accompanying narrative so that people can follow it. Because in itself, it's not very like adaptable to stage, but if you kind of add a narrative system that works, it could work really interesting as anecdotes, for example. The next work is Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, by Sophocles. This is a tragedy. So this is not just a story about fate, as some people would say. It's about investigation, civic contamination, procedural revelation, and destruction of authority through truth. The governing principle is very simple. A search for order becomes a mechanism of collapse. Tragedy works only if revelation remains structurally unavoidable. And every answer must narrow reality. Every attempt to restore stability must intensify catastrophe. The whole engine is public. So the audience watches authority unravel in real time. So of course, it's a wonderful drama. Because it shows testimony, interruption, recognition, and irreversible disclosure. And it's not hidden psychology. It's definitely exposure under civic pressure. The audience should always understand who controls interpretation, who is destabilizing, and how the truth shifts the authority here. So the authority system is centralized civic authority. Oedipus is ruler, investigator, judge, and concealed source of contamination. So that structure depends upon visible legitimacy, collapsing progressively. Constraint system. Investigative constraint. The inquiry cannot stop once initiated. Every witness, messenger, fragment of testimony reduces available escape routes. So it's kind of compression by truth. Temporal system. Irreversible revelation. Structure advances through sequential disclosure. There are no cyclical recoveries. And once knowledge appears, reversal is impossible. Transmission system is choral civic witnessing. The choir functions as public conscience, social stabilizer, and audience orientation. So without the chorus, the civic scale weakens. So let's break it down a little bit by acts. The city enters visible disorder. Plague destabilizes the civic confidence. Oedipus appears decisive, rational, and operational and capable. The investigation begins, of course, as an act of governance. Act 2 is a reveal. Witnesses progressively dismantle institutional certainty. Oedipus attempts to preserve order while accelerating self-exposure. And every new disclosure shows pressure, reducing flexibility, and destabilizing authority. So it kind of needs to feel like a tightening of a screw. And then there's expulsion. So the truth becomes physically undeniable. Authority collapses publicly. The ruler transforms into contamination. Order is restored through ritual removal. The ending is not emotional healing. And the civic order reestablishes through sacrifice. So lighting should definitely function diagnostically. So darkness, of course, is incomplete knowledge, conceals causality, interpretive uncertainty. Progressive exposure matters more than atmosphere. Avoid excess expressionism. This work is, of course, depending on clarity. We have visual tension, which emerges from contradiction between sovereign posture, investigative confidence, and increasing contamination. The audience should see collapse approaching before Oedipus does. And the eye must always return to Oedipus as a center. So spatial organization should reinforce command centrality and procedural control. So until you can't, then the shift from governing center to expelled person is the primary visual movement. So the transformation of Oedipus from elevated ruler to physically ruined exile is really important because it carries into the whole structure. The adaptation collapses if Oedipus becomes merely neurotic, or revelation will lose the clarity there, or the chorus becomes more just a decoration, or the spectacle overrides the real emotional investigative part. So this is not a psychological melodrama. It's more of a thing about civic machinery. So here we can see architecture, staging, emphasizing public judgment, ritual speech, and revelation. And the chorus operates as a civic organization, not just a narration device here. So that means that extreme reduction using thresholds, elevation, witness positions, light translations, and spatial isolation are good, but we should not use too much excessive realism. And the takeaway here is this may be the single most structurally perfect investigative tragedy ever written in history. So the audience needs to understand the collapse before they experience it emotionally. And so if revelation remains clear, the play becomes almost impossible to fail theatrically if the actors are good. So the wristband is low. The ensemble size would be 10 to 30 players, and it's a 10 out of 10 for touring. And the rehearsal failure would happen if revelation pacing weakens, or chorus coordination deteriorates, or emotional excess overrides procedural escalation, or witness scene loses clarity, or authority relationships become too ambiguous. Don't stage if audiences require explanation to follow revelation. Oedipus lacks immediate authority, or the chorus becomes passive, or the symbolism replaces the tension, or something disrupts the script. You got to keep it close to the script. So it's very much exceptional. We probably give it a 98%. And this should be a priority repertory production. And yeah, it's one of the better tragedies out there until now. The next one is Antigone, or Antigone, by Sophocles. And sorry for the title not being there. But basically, this one is a tragedy as well. And this is not a play only about somewhat like a rebellion. It's about competing authorities, civic order, sacred obligation, and the collision between law and conscience. So the principle is very simple. Two coherent systems of duty become irreconcilable. So tragedy works because neither side is irrational. And the catastrophe comes from rigidity under pressure. So this works because Antigone is immediately legible. The audience understands who governs, who resists, what rule has been violated, and what consequences come. Nothing requires philosophical explanation too much. Drama advances through decree, refusal, confrontation, escalation, and punishment. So everything is playable. And the authority system is dual authority collision. So Creon represents civic stability, procedural law, institutional continuity. Antigone is sacred duty, familial obligation, and moral permanence. So the system works because both authorities remain intelligible here. So that means that the constraint system is moral constraint. Neither side can retreat without self-destruction, and compromise becomes structurally impossible once public declarations happen. The tragedy emerges from positional rigidity here. So the escalation is inevitable. Each confrontation narrows possible outcomes, and public speech is definitely like a locking machinery. So once spoken positions are very hard. So this also is transmitted through the choral civic mediation. The chorus observes fear, uncertainty, and political instability, and preserves the play from collapsing into private melodrama. So we have a few acts here, which is where Creon establishes the civic order through prohibition. Antigone immediately violates this. The central conflict appears right away, and no narrative delay exists. Public authority and sacred obligation collide directly. Both sides intensify commitment under pressure. Every side raises the stakes politically, morally, and socially, and the structure depends upon visible escalation. So punishment produces systemic destruction. Creon preserves the law but destroys legitimacy. Order survives formally but collapses morally. And the end, we have stability at catastrophic human cost. So for lighting, we can say the lighting should emphasize civic severity. Don't be too romantic. It should feel judicial, exposed, public, and unforgiving. And the visual tension comes from spatial opposition, ruler versus dissenter, state versus burial, public decree versus sacred ritual. The audience must feel the impossibility of coexistence. The eye also comes between Creon's architectural control and Antigone's resistance. The value system depends upon asymmetry between institutional scale and individual conditions. And most important decision is whether Antigone appears physically diminished or spiritually immovable. The choice is important. And the adaptation would collapse if Creon becomes a cartoon character, or Antigone becomes sentimental martyr, or political structure loses clarity, or the chorus work weakens, or emotional realism replaces civic scale, or it just becomes something like a feminist work, because that's not exactly what this is. This is more public of governance under moral fracture. So civic chamber production would be great. So you could use, of course, it already is a drama. So you could use, of course, staging, emphasizing decree, trial, punishment, and institutional space. But you could also make this into a more dance work as well. You can focus on the funerary action and sacred transgression as the primary engine. And you can also, in fact, use this in opera possibly. So if you have a more minimalist production, you could use elevated platforms, processional movement, chorus, geometry, and public exposure. The takeaway here is that this is one of the cleanest law versus conscience kind of structures, and the audience should understand the conflict within minutes. So you don't really need it like a long exposition. If both sides remain legible, this can work very well. And the wristband is sort of low. And it's about 10 to 25 performers. It's very good for touring because it's not very big cast. The immediate concern, of course, happens as if Creon loses the authority, or Antigone becomes just emotional, or the chorus really weakens things, or it really just becomes too diluted, or just, oh, this is a feminist drama, or oh, this is just this. It's very complex as a work. It's not something you can just put into a little box. And don't stage if either side becomes simplistic, or the political structure becomes vague, or the chorus becomes ornamental, or the spectacle will overtake some sort of moral conflict, or the ending kind of is softening the consequence here. So we can give it a 97 out of 100. It's very good. So it would be an essential repertory staging for civic tragedy programming. The next work, there's the title. Just loaded later. Sorry about that. Is Oedipus at Colonus by Sophocles. And this is a tragedy as well. And this is not just a continuation of investigation. It's about late authority, civic absorption of suffering, and the transformation of a ruined figure into a political instrument. The governing principle is power does not end in collapse, but reallocates into legitimacy. So the work is aftermath logic. So it works because the whole structure is spatial. Oedipus is no longer ruler or investigator. He is a contested body, a political burden, and a source of unstable legitimacy. So the audience understands multiple powers want him, none can fully claim him, and his presence reorganizes civic order wherever he goes. So the authority system is displaced authority. Legitimacy is no longer held by Oedipus, and it's projected on him by competing forces. So Athens, Thebes, and ritual law. And so authority becomes externalized. Constraint system, spatial constraint, Oedipus cannot leave, his body is fixed within contested territory, movement itself becomes political violation. There's terminal suspension, there's no investigative progression, time becomes waiting and negotiation and controlled transition towards death. This is a post-trajectory structure. So choral territorial witnessing, the chorus is a place-based moral witness and stabilizer of contested sacred geography. They anchor meaning and location rather than they're anchoring the meaning and location. So let's give a few points of the story. We have Oedipus and coming into exile condition. He's not recognized as sovereign. His presence is disrupting local equilibrium, and competing powers try to expel him or claim him. His body becomes territory, and negotiation replaces investigation. Authority, of course, here is negotiated in real time. And a final decision reallocates Oedipus into sacred protection. Death becomes political stabilization, and his disappearance resolves civic instability. So, for lighting, you should use territorial ambiguity. Oedipus must appear nearly fully visible or fully excluded at certain times. He exists in liminal visibility. Light marks the claims over space. Tension arises from competing claims on a signal body. No action, no conflict, but ownership and pressure. Eyes must track who approaches Oedipus, who retreats, and how space reorganizes around his position. The most important visual decision is whether Oedipus is staged as sacred relic, asset, or contaminant. So, of course, this can fail if Oedipus is just a psychological force of introspection, or claims are unclear, or space loses meaning, or the chorus becomes just passive. So this could work as geography theater, staging built around thresholds, borders, protected zones, and contested entry points, or it could be a ritual drama focusing on negotiation, arrival, and custody rather than action. Or you could use this as minimal exile configuration, space staging with a single structure, figure, rotating claimants, and controlled movement across zones. You could stage this as a dance too, or you could just stage it as the play that it is, which is very powerful. This is a post-tragedy system, so there's no investigation left, only what happens to a ruined authority after history no longer knows what to do. So the audience needs to feel this thing shifting in real time. So the wristband is medium to low, and you can have 10 to 20 performers. It's good for touring. And it's important that you need to make sure that the territorial claims are clear, and Oedipus structure needs to be importantly staged. And it cannot just be a political play, because this is more about someone who is losing their identity as well. So this is a 92 out of 100. This is good for repertory theater. The next work is Ajax, again by Sophocles. And this is another tragedy. And this is about honor collapse, institutional betrayal, and the breakdown of heroic identity under civic recalibration. So when symbolic honor is removed, identity becomes strategically unstable. The work functions through the degradation of status, not just some kind of external catastrophe. This works on stage because it is spatial aftermath driven. Ajax is not in control of the civic system. He is displaced, dishonored, and isolated from recognition systems. And the audience reads exclusion, silence, and refusal of burial, and contested memory. So this is collapsed heroic authority. It begins as a step embedded within military honor system and becomes excluded from recognition frameworks. Authority is withdrawn rather than contested, and honor is a constraint. The character is trapped by internal code. Shame becomes irreversible structure, and recovery is not socially available. And here, this is a self-locking system. So post-action aftermath happens. All major action is already occurring before the play stabilizes. So we have consequence processing, memory negotiation, and burial control. This is a choral civic arbitration. So the chorus is moral mediator and social memory system and stabilizes mechanism between opposing burial claims. So here we have the act structure. Ajax is removed from his heroic legitimacy. His identity no longer aligns with civic valuation systems and recognition fractures. Internal honor logic overrides civic mediation. Psychological rupture manifests as irreversible action. And the system collapses inwardly. So what does that mean? That means that there's also a burial conflict. So the body becomes a political issue, and the central question is who controls memory, who authorizes the burial, and who defines meaning after collapse. So lighting should emphasize isolation. Ajax must appear separated from civic visibility, erased from communal recognition systems, and tension comes from refusal of burial, spatial isolation, and competing claims over a dead or dying body. And this conflict is jurisdiction over meaning after the action ends. So the eye must track Ajax's isolation, chorus mediation attempts, and the shifting authority over his body. So whether Ajax is staged as heroic reminder, erased figure, or politically dangerous, it depends. So basically, you should focus on corpse custody, ritual authority, and civic decision making under moral fixture. So you can use sparse staging if you want, with isolated figure, contested perimeter, and controlled ritual interventions, or you could use memory structure, remembrance, forgetting, and institutional refusal of honor. The takeaway is this is a system about what happens when recognition is withdrawn and cannot be restored. The audience needs to feel that the identity is not internal, but granted and revoked publicly. Once revoked, structure collapses inwardly. So this is a medium risk. This has an ensemble size of 12 to 25 people. Recording viability is about 8 to 10, 8 out of 10. And don't stage it if civic recognition systems are unclear, corpse politics are minimalized, or emotional realism replaces structural exclusion. So we would give it right now 90 out of 100. It's very strong. It's a repertory work focused on spatial isolation. So works for us. The sixth work we want to talk about, is Philoctetes. So Philoctetes. And this one is by Sophocles, again, is a tragedy. It's not just a story about suffering here. So this is about weaponized necessity, ethical manipulation, and the coercion of moral action under strategic pressure. The principle is moral choice becomes structurally impossible when survival and duty are forcibly aligned. So this work operates through engineered ethical compression. And it works because the three forces define the entire system: the wounded exile, and political agent, and the moral intermediary. So the audience is always underneath. Who needs something, who controls access, and who is being ethically pressured. It's about spatial negotiation under moral constraint. So we have our authority system, which is instrumental authority. Power is not held by status alone. It is exercised through access control, persuasion, and strategic dependency. So Neoptolemus, becomes the unstable authority node. I can't pronounce these people's names easily, sorry. The constraint system here is moral coercion constraint, and there's no action is free. So helping is manipulation, and refusing is cruelty. Honesty becomes strategically unusable for the characters in their minds, and ethics functions as somewhat mechanical in this case. So deferred resolution structure. Narrative oscillates between deception, disclosure, reversal, and ethical correction. Time is governed by moral recalibration, and triadic ethical dialogue is there with meaning transmitted through persuasion, resistance, and moral interruption. Speech is the primary weapon. So if we look at it, we break it down. Neoptolemus is tasked with acquiring Philoctetes through deception. The ethical framework is to subordinate to a strategic necessity. The system established as manipulation first. Deception becomes to fail structurally. And Philoctetes' suffering destabilizes instrumental logic. Neoptolemus becomes ethically unsuitable or unstable. The system begins to invert. Truth is restored, but the restoration is not clean. It's forced by necessity. So we go from extraction to reluctant moral alignment. Lighting here should emphasize exposure and isolation. Philoctetes must appear abandoned, structurally exposed, physically marginalized, and light is more about vulnerability here. Tension arises through proximity versus referral, compassion versus strategy, isolation versus access control, and the stage must consistently show who can approach and who cannot. I should track access barriers, physical distance changes, and movements of ethical hesitation and movement. Small shifts can carry maximum meaning. Most important visual decision is whether neothalamus physically closes distance or maintains separation. And this can work if it is a coercion system, stage and space. So you can focus on chamber theater, as it was originally, and focus on negotiation, persuasion, refusal, and reverse cycles, or you can use minimal three-body systems, strict staging of exile, agent, and mediator. Or you could use site-specific isolation theater with environment used to amplify abandonment, distance, and controlled access. You can also use this as a dance. And the takeaway here is that it's a system where ethics is not discussed, it's applied under some pressure. So the audience must consistently feel that every choice has necessity and is also compromised. So some controls. So wristband is medium, ensemble size 3 to 12 players, touring is 8 out of 10. And don't stage if moral conflict is not embodied through action or Philoctetes is reduced to a metaphor or control dynamics are not clear. So this is a 91 out of 100. It's very good. It's exceptional, in fact. And it's a good candidate for intimate ethical structure staging and for dance. So the next one is Women of Trachis by Antigone by Sophocles. And this is a tragedy again, and this is not just some kind of heroic narrative. It's kind of a system more about domestic proximity to violence, delayed consequence, and collapse caused by mismanaged heroic legacy. The principle here is heroism not controlled by its own narrative, but leaking into domestic space. So the tragedy operates through proximity rather than battlefield action, and it works on stage because drama is contained, intimate, and spatially controlled. The audience experiences household pressure, offstage violence arriving as consequence, and emotional collapse triggered by delayed knowledge. The most important events are not shown, but received here, so that's very interesting. The authority system is indirect heroic authority. Heracles is absent, but structurally dominant, and authority is transmitted through reputation, consequence, and secondary testimony. Domestic containment is another constraint. The household functions as a pressure chamber receiving consequences from external heroic systems. There's no escaping from incoming structural fallouts. So there's delayed revelation. Critical events happen offstage and arrive later. Time is structured as aftermath compression. And domestic witness system meaning is carried by family speech, fragmented testimony, and emotional relay between confined characters. So the first act is waiting. Domestic space appears stable. External heroic actions are offstage. The household operates under incomplete knowledge. Then there are offstage actions beginning to arrive as structured damage. So information enters in fragments. It's unclear, it's partial, and it's irreversible. So the system starts to destabilize through delayed truth. And in Act 3, we have collapse of domestic order. The household reorganizes under unbearable consequences. And heroic identity collapses into domestic catastrophes. So resolution is not repair in this case. It's, irreversible harm for people. So that's a really important point. The lighting should emphasize enclosure and sort of suffocation. Interior shadow, confined visibility, delayed revelation through gradual exposure. Light reveals consequences. So tension should arise from absence of the hero, arrival of consequences, and emotional strain within confined space. So that's important. And the eye should track household reactions, entry points of information, and shifts in relational proximity. And the most important thing is how offstage violence is translated into onstage domestic consequences. And that's kind of important. So it can collapse if heroic action is staged directly, or if domestic space becomes melodramatic cliche, or if offstage structure loses clarity or consequence is softened into sentimental works only. So this can work in domestic pressure chamber theater, intimate staging, which is what it originally was, intimate staging, emphasizing enclosed space, incoming testimony, and emotional containment. Or we can use the offstage violence architecture, which has a strict separation between scene heroic action and the domestic collapse. And we should also use minimal interior collapse format, so small ensemble focusing on reaction, reception, and structural breakdowns. So the takeaway here is this is a system where the most important actions are never shown. The audience must understand that what is absent is doing more work than what is visible here. So the household becomes a receiver of a larger violence system that it cannot control. So we could say this is minimum risk. It's for 5 to 15 players. Touring by ability 8 out of 10. And we would give this an 88%. Suitable for intimate chamber staging with offstage action architecture. The next work is the Odyssey by Homer. And this is an epic poem. And this isn't just a travel narrative like some people would say. This is about identity under displacement, survival through deception, and the restoration of order through return. The governing principle is identity is not stable. It's reconstructed through successive trials of recognition. So it's a return engine under hostile fragmentation. So this works, of course, and it's been adapted many times because it's more of a structural episodic framework. And the audience can always read survival pressures, shifting environments, changes of rules of engagement, and identity verification systems. So recognition is the central dramatic mechanism, which is who is he, who recognizes him, what proofs are required, and so forth. So we can see the distributed and unstable authority here. Authority shifts between hosts, strangers, and enemies, and sovereigns disguised. And legitimacy must be repeatedly re-earned. So the constraint system here is survival constraint under navigation pressures. Every episode shows new environmental rules, new social systems, and new threats. So the protagonist has to constantly adapt, which means that there's a cyclical system here, where time is shaped by detours, setbacks, disguises, and deferred recognition. So reform is more inevitable. The transmission system is oral episodic memory structure, meaning is carried through repeated storytelling, mythic episodes, and recognition sequences. So each segment is self-contained but linked. So if we look at the basic act structure, the protagonist is displaced from origin, identity is unstable, home exists only as memory and objective. Survival requires concealment. Each encounter tests identity recognition, social negotiation, and strategic deception. And the self is continually also reconstructed. And in the third part, we can see the identity is revealed through structure recognition. Order is restored through verification, reestablishment of the household is there, and elimination of disorder. So that eventually closes the loop. Lighting should function as environmental transition, and each location looks for new visual design, new clarity conditions, new threat structures. And attention comes from disguise versus recognition, stranger versus sovereign, hospitality versus hostility. And then the central question is always, who is this person in this space? So the eye should track identity verification moments, shifts in disguise, and changes in social recognition. And the most important thing is to show the moment of recognition reversal when hidden identity becomes visible authority, and this is very important. The adaptation would definitely crash. It became just like a disconnected spectacle or lost the clarity there, or if disguise has no functional purpose. And so you'd look at it as an episodic survival theater where segmented staging within modular environments shift rules per scene and identity verification systems, or you could look at it as a disguise and recognition kind of work where we focus on concealment testing and revelation mechanics, or you could look at it as minimal return structure for reduced ensemble emphasizing protagonist special features and recognition agents. So the main takeaway is this is a return system built on identity and instability. The audience must constantly reassess who the protagonist is in each time, and the final recognition is non-emotional as much as it is also structural reconfirmation. So the wristband here is medium or low, which is why it's being adapted all the time. And there's for 10 to 40 players, and it's 9 out of 10. So we would say that the score for this is 98 out of 100, and it's a priority episodic repertory production with strong recognition, design, direction. So the next one is the Iliad by Homer as well. And this is another epic poem. This is a system about concentrated rage, honor as operational currency, and the collapse of order under singular emotional force. The governing principle is when a single effect becomes structurally dominant, the system of war reorganizes around it. So everything is subordinated in some way to escalation through honor logic. So the structure here is immediately recognizable and readable in spatial and kinetic terms, where the audience can track force, concentration, withdrawal, escalation cycles, and breakdown of coordination. And this drama is not just about some kind of plot complexity because it's working as pressure accumulation until the system fails. So that means that there's a lot of fragmented heroic authority, where command is distributed among competing leaders, unstable alliances, and individual heroic dominance. And we can also see here authority constantly contested through action. Honor constraint under unclear war pressure, characters cannot disengage without identity collapse. Honor functions as a binding force, escalation trigger, and structural trap. Accelerated irreversible escalations happen, time compresses under pressure, decisions become immediate, consequences become permanent, and recovery becomes impossible. So we have here the heroic oral amplification, meaning it's transmitted through repeated heroic naming, escalated insult and praise cycles, and communal memory of violence. So we have a few things in the act structure that we want to talk about. War is ongoing but unstable. Competing forces are locked in unresolved equilibrium. Honor disputes drive positioning. A singular emotional force dominates the system. Coordination breaks down. Action becomes increasingly asymmetric. The system reorganizes around one escalating center. The war continues structurally but has already been defined by irreversible collapse. Resolution doesn't happen more as of a closure because it's a containment of damage after systemic failures. So lighting here must emphasize the intensity gradient, so extreme exposure, harsh contrast, and visibility under pressure. So everything needs to feel a little bit exposed at times of apex or real conflict. The tension comes from proximity to violence, fragmentation of command, and escalating imbalance in force distribution. And the eye needs to follow centers of force, shifts in dominance, and withdrawal patterns. And so, the moment, for example, the moment Achilles withdraws from the system of war, the abstinence reorganizes everything. That's a very important visual decision. And, this is not just war storytelling for us. It's more of like a breakdown of a system under concentrated effect. So, adaptation routes, high intensity ensemble warfare. We have large scale staging emphasizing force shifts, battlefield geometry, and escalation visibility. We have hero centered structural collapse model focusing on Achilles as pressure node and system deformation around the withdrawal. We have minimal warfield reduction where we could use strip staging using banners, movement vectors, and sound pressure, and spatial dominance shifts. Basically, this is a system where motion is not just internal here. So you have to look at the infrastructure. You have to look at the rage reorganizing reality, and the audience needs to feel the entire system bending around a single withdrawal force. So the wristband is medium. Ensemble size could be 20 to 80 players. Could be 8 out of 10 for touring. And obviously you need to take care with this piece because it is more bellicose, but we could give it a 98 of 100. So it's a priority for a large-scale repertory war system production. Now, work number 10 is Works and Days by Hesiod, which is a didactic epic. This is a system about labor discipline, more order and survival governed by cyclical time. Governing principle is human order is maintained through structural labor aligned with cosmic constraint. This is a regulatory model. And the stage ability is not evident driven. It works through cycles of war, seasonal rhythm, instruction embedded in action, and moralized repetition. The audience reads structure more than story. And the authority system, didactic authority. Audience authority is not contested. It's more transmitted, accepted, and reinforced through instruction. Speaker functions as a moral regulator. Environmental constraints will be human activities bound by seasonal cycles, agricultural limits, and survival necessity. The system is governed by nature. Cyclical return system. Time is not linear. It's structured through seasons, repetition, and predictable recurrence. Meaning comes from rhythm. So, transmission system. Instructional oral transmission. Knowledge is delivered through maxims, repetition, and debated moral lessons. Forms and content are inseparable. Act 1. We have the system defines labor, justice, and cosmic structure. Rules of survival are articulated. Human life is placed within governed cycles. Work is enacted as a moral necessity. Daily and seasonal repetition enforce order. Failure to comply results in degradation. Devaluation from structured labor leads to disorder. Justice is framed as alignment with natural cycles. Stability is restored through renewed discipline. Lighting should follow cycles: dawn, clarity, midday, exposure, dark, dusk, closure, and so forth. Tension is minimal, so it derives from labor pressure, resource scarcity, and compliance versus deviation. There is no dramatic confrontation. So the eye should track work gestures, seasonal transitions, and instructional delivery. The representation of labor as structured rhythm rather than physical struggle determines whether the system needs correctly. And you could use ritual labor theater or dance. You could use staging built around repetitive actions, seasonal transitions, and instructional speech. Environmental cycle performance with light cycles, seasonal markers, and agricultural metaphors. You could use minimal instructional form with reduced ensemble showing maxims, gestures, and cyclical reenactment. This is a system of ordered survival, so everything kind of goes in a cycle. The audience needs to feel that stability is produced. So this could be a low risk for 10 to 40 performers. It would work better for me, I think, as a dance. And as far as staging, we could say 80 out of 100. It's stable for ritual cycle staging and instructional ensembles. So now the next one is 11. The 11th work is The Histories by Herodotus. And this is a historical narrative. So this is a system about competing accounts of truth, cultural collision under expansion pressure, and history as stage testimony. So the governing principle is truth emerging through structured comparison of conflicting narratives under civic observation. So this works because this is polyphonic and the audience tracks shift in cultural perspective, contrasting accounts of events and instability of certainty. There's no authoritative viewpoint, only structured disagreement. This produces consistent interpretive tension. So we have here distributed narrative authority. And authority is fragmented across storytellers, cultures, and competing cycles. There's a epistemic constraint, which is knowledge is limited by perspective, cultural framing, and transmission bias. Truth is never total. So layered historical accumulation is there. Time functions as accretion of accounts, and events are reinterpreted across retellings. Oral history about the system is there, which means meanings transmitted through embedded storytelling, ethnographic description, and narrative recursion. So we have multiple cultures and geographies are introduced. The system establishes diversity of culture, customs, conflicting values, and emerging context zones. We also can see conflicting accounts. Events are retold through different lenses. No version is dominant, and the audience experiences structured epistemic instability. So outcomes are assembled through comparison, and meaning emerges from juxtaposition, not closure. History is become more of a civic interpretation. So we can see here lighting should shift between cultural zones. And you can show the change in worldviews, not just location. So that can also be done in the staging. Tension arises from competing truths, narrative contradiction, and instability of interpretations. So the eye needs to track shifts in narrative sources, changes in cultural framing, and moments of contradiction. We can see the most important part here is how distinct narrative voices are shown spatially and whether the audience can see disagreement and structure. The adaptation can collapse if all perspectives are flattened into one voice, or if cultural difference is aestheticized instead of structural. And we can see there's polyphonic civic theater with multiple performances showing different cultural viewpoints, competing historical accounts, and so forth. Spatially distinct zones show cultural frameworks and interpretive systems, fragmented storytelling with overlapping testimony, unresolved contradictions, and so forth. This is a system where truth is more assembled and the audience must actively reconcile conflicting accounts in real time. So meaning is civic construction in process, not a narrative endpoint. So we have commissioning controls where the wristband is medium. Ensemble size of 15 to 60 players. We could say touring viability would be 8. And as far as our final assessment, we give it 89 out of 100. So program is it should be a multi-voice civic historiography performance system. So it could be done as dance, it could be done as music, it could be done as theater, but it has to be done well. So you kind of have to dig into it a little bit more. The last work we want to look at is Shahnameh by Ferdowsi. Cannot pronounce his name correctly, I think. But anyways, an epic cycle. And this is a system about civilizational continuity, dynastic legitimacy under moral pressure, and the transmission of order across time through narrative lineage. This is from 1010 CE. And the principle here is a civilization survives only insofar as authority can be continuously re-authenticated through story. There is a long duration governance structure here, which is more epic. The stage function is dynastic and cumulative, and the audience sees succession crises, moral testing of rulers, and repeated cycles of legitimacy and collapse, which happen here. And power is never stable, it's always being revalidated. And this creates many structural tensions across generations. So dynastic authority under moral stress is there, and kinship is inherited, tested, and repeatedly destabilized by ethical failure or cosmic rupture. Authority must be continually proven. Ethical cosmic constraint, rulers are constrained by fate, justice, lineage, expectation, and moral consequence across generations, and no decision is isolated in time. Temporal system is there with generational recursion. Time operates through repeated dynastic cycles, again, rise and fall of rulers, and consequent structures. So epic lineage transmission is there, meaning is carried through heroic genealogies, repeated myth structures, and into generational narrative memory. And the story itself stabilizes civilization. So we have our founding order, where civilization is established through heroic and semi-mythic origin. Legitimacy is anchored in foundational acts, and we have fracture and testing. Rulers face ethical, political, and cosmic challenges. Legitimacy is destabilized and reasserted. Order becomes fragile under succession pressure. Then we have continuity through memory. So despite collapse cycles, the system persists through narrative transmission. Civilization survives because its story survives, and legitimacy becomes archival and cultural. So we have lighting should distinguish dynastic eras. Each regime should feel like a new historical climate. Light becomes civilizational time marker, and tension arises from succession, instability, moral judgment of rulers, and collapse, reconstruction, cycles of power, and so forth. And the eyes need to track transition between rulers, symbols of legitimacy, and moments of moral testing. So the most important thing is how each ruler is framed in the moment of moral judgment. And this shows whether legitimacy feels earned or so forth. And you could use dynastic cyclical theater, which is large-scale episodic staging with rotating rulers, recurring moral tests, and visible legitimacy transition. This could be done in dance as well. Mythical, you could also make this mythical sort of thing. And you could also make it more like a kind of like a story where you have different visual motifs going on. Anyway, the end of the story is that you really need to take care because the work can easily fall into the trap of being overdone. So, in conclusion, I think it's also important to notice that the payoff really needs to be there for our audience. So in this case, I would give it a 80 out of 100 and definitely recommend it because it could be really adaptable. There's a lot of interesting stories and stuff there. Which brings us to the end of our little session, and we hope that you found some works that were interesting to you. The reason why we're doing this is because a lot of people don't really get involved with the classics too much or works, and people don't know what's super adaptable unless they've really read it. And this is kind of a starting point for people if they want to learn more about these works. They should definitely read them and support the artists and people that are making these works adaptable. And we try to go around the world with these works, not trying to be restricted to one continent or place. Although we did a lot of Greek work, right now that's because of the order in which we're doing it. Anyway, we hope that you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you find yourselves. And yeah, let's see where this goes. We may be able to record more regularly as time permits. So have a wonderful morning, afternoon, and evening, and we'll see you around.